right at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Danny, for showing up. I am very excited. So if you couldn't tell from the last couple days, I really love Tailwind, and the fact that they have saved 5 hours of work every single week is why I talk about Tailwind all the time. And I have tried all the others out there because I'll have clients that come to me about it and I want to know about them, and nothing comes close to Tailwind. So I had to say that before you began, Danny, because I'm very excited about Tailwind. And I'm very excited about this presentation. So Danny, CEO and founder of Tailwind, has graciously agreed to come talk to us about stats. I love me a stat. I love facts and I love analytics to really know that you're doing the right thing in your marketing. And this research is insanely good and shocked me a lot. So I'm really excited. Go ahead and take it away, Danny. And thanks again for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. It's a lot of fun and a pleasure to be here, and we certainly appreciate the shout outs and the love as well. Yeah, working on this research really was it was interesting for us. It's something that we've done periodically over time because as you know, Tailwind's been working with Pinterest for 13 years maybe at this point. And so over that time, there have been a lot of changes in the platform. And we want to make sure we keep abreast of those so that we know that what we're recommending is the right thing, right? And that's ultimately why we did this study now. What we're trying to answer ultimately with this study was what works on Pinterest today, right? There are a lot of beliefs we have based on what's worked in the past, what has worked historically. We've also seen that changes over time. And so in going through this, we looked at over 1 million total pins. That was spanning over 17,000 accounts. And really, there were kind of two blocks of activity we were looking at, right? One was when you look at these accounts and you ask, okay, right now, today, what are the top pins that are driving most of the engagement and activity for these accounts? And then analyzing certain things about those pins. And then there was a second element, which is looking at new pin creates that have just been made within the last 90 days and looking at how new content evolves and grows. Because, we'll test this in a second, but at least historically, we've always thought of Pinterest as an evergreen platform, right? And so naturally, there's going to be a difference between new content and content that's had longer to age in. But there have been big changes, and that's why we wanted to do this now. So fresh pins, while at this point is a term that came about multiple years ago, it's something that still isn't always clear to a lot of folks. What exactly is a fresh pin? What makes a pin fresh? How fresh does it need to be? Are there levels of freshness? And so that is something where I think the definition has actually changed over time as well. And so that's an important element in Pinterest thinking about how they surface content. Idea pins was the other really big change in this time period. They came, they saw, they conquered, and then they left, right? And so at one point, all of our home feeds were completely inundated with idea pins, and that was the vast majority of what was getting exposure in order to get people used to that new type of pin, and now they're gone. And so what's getting exposure today? And then there are other elements that Pinterest has been talking about very publicly, including in things like when they update Wall Street every quarter on how they're doing. Focusing more on shopping and commercial type categories, and use of AI for personalization. There have been lots of new brands and creators coming onto the platform, and so new types of content as well. And so that's why we wanted to do this big study as a little bit of a reset for some of the assumptions we might have had. So with that, let's jump into it. So that very first question that I teased about, is Pinterest an evergreen platform? Indeed, the data did show us that Pinterest is still an evergreen platform. And specifically when we looked at what were the top pins that are driving engagement right now and how old are they, this is how it broke out. So the top line is showing the number of pins. by time period. So starting on the left with the darker blue, tailwind blue, less than 90 days old on newer pins, out to the right with the darker gray of pins that are over 2 years old. You can see roughly half of the pins that we're driving engagement now are at least a year old. But it was actually more than 60% of the engagement on the accounts that was coming from those pins. So the older pins, pound for pound, so to speak, are driving more engagement per pin than the newer ones. And you can see the inverse on the other side of the equation. The newer pins, 16% of the pins that were driving engagement right now were less than 90 days old, but they were only driving 6% of the engagement. And so why might this be, and why is this important? A lot of it comes down to, I think, how people plan their strategy and set expectations for Pinterest. And it's really critical to understand that when you're planning content, when you're planning strategy, you need to think about content that you still want representing your brand a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, even, if you can imagine that. And not necessarily content that's going to be irrelevant, 30 days from now, 60 days from now, 90 days from now, right? And that's a bit different than other platforms. In a lot of ways, you might think of content a little bit more like SEO than you do other platforms. Another way to look at that is trying to ask, okay, for these pins that are driving engagement, and I'll get to the term winning pins in a second, when do they actually peak, right? And so what we saw in the data was that it appears right now there's an average peak happening somewhere between 1 and 2 years old, right? So the amount of engagement is actually growing on average over that time period. And then once it's over 2 years old, we did start to see some decline. But that doesn't mean there's not still potentially a very long lifespan and a very long tail on the back end. The reason we're referring to these as winning pins is because this data set is only showing the pins that are driving engagement right now, today, right? And so by definition, they're the pins that won the competition for your attention, right? So they were all new pins at one point in time. Pinterest didn't know yet if they were valuable, if they should be trusted, if they were bringing useful ideas and information. They had to be tested. And eventually it was determined that, yes, these pins are good. And that's why these are the pins that are still showing, 1 to 2 years or 2 years plus later, right? For those same time periods, there would have been a lot of other pins that have since fallen off and aren't driving any engagement. So those are not even showing up in this data set, right? So the way to think about this is the pins that do ultimately succeed are going to build this type of momentum. And then eventually, though, they will start aging out and phasing out of the population. And so that's what we mean by winning pins. So you can imagine, a very simplified view of what Pinterest is doing here with new content is that every day there's a new set of pins, you could think of it, that are coming online on Pinterest, right? And so Pinterest needs to do some initial things like understand what the content is, categorize it, map it into the graph so that they know what interests it belongs to, what search queries it might be relevant to, and so forth. But then ultimately they need to test this new content and determine whether or not it's worthy of further exposure, right? So what we see in the data is that pretty much all pins that are newer are getting some level of test exposure. There might be some exceptions to that. So some content might be flagged as objectionable or, not in categories that Pinterest allows, or might have other issues like copyright issues. So that content might not get any visibility. But for the vast majority of pins, there's going to be this initial test exposure. But then, depending on the engagement levels they see and the signals they get back about relevance in specific interests, in specific searches, and so forth, not necessarily all those pins are going to continue advancing to more and more exposure, right? Some of them are going to be taken out so that the attention that's available can be funneled towards the better content in that group. A little bit more time goes by, these pins get some more exposure, and that happens again and again until eventually we're whittled down to the winners, right? And these are the winning pins. These are the pins that on your account are going to look like they're driving significantly more engagement significantly more traction than the others. And these are the pins that have that shot at a multi-year lifespan where they're going to continue bringing value, right? So it's not every pin that's going to do that. It's the winning pins, right? And then when you think about the Pinterest feed that you're looking at, whether it's the home feed or search results, related pins, whatever it might be, most of what you're looking at really are the winners, right? It's the winning pins of the past that have been deemed good and worthy of your attention and relevant, but there's going to be some of the new sprinkled in, right? And so the new is being tested alongside the winners of the past. Some of those will rise up and become winners as well. Some of the winners of the past will eventually fade out because they're replaced by better content or equally good but newer content. And that's how Pinterest maintains a very high degree of relevance while also having a degree of freshness to the content at the same time. Because there was probably a time maybe 5 or 6 years ago where one of the biggest complaints was I keep seeing the same pins over and over again, right? And that's really where fresh pins and that whole concept came from, was an effort to ultimately change that dynamic so people weren't burning out on the equivalent of watching the same rerun of a TV show too many times, right? So with that said, why am I talking so much about winning pins? It's because what the data shows us is that the winning pins are very, very important in the overall Pinterest ecosystem. And so what this chart is showing is when we look at all of the impressions and all of the clicks that all of the pins that were driving engagement in this period got, how much of that went to the top pins, right? And we look at it as the top 20% of pins, top 10% of pins, top 5%, top 1%, and top 0.1%. But starting at the top here, the top 20% of pins are getting roughly 90% of all impressions and clicks, right? So because of that filtering out mechanism that happens through Pinterest algorithms and testing content, a lot of the content what this tells us, a lot of the content that doesn't win in that test period ultimately ends up getting very little attention, very few impressions, very few clicks. The top 20% get the lion's share. But what jumped out to me here is if you jump down to the 1% group, top 1%, they're getting over half, right? And so that's really an extreme distribution that you're seeing here. It's not linear. It's really more of an exponential distribution. And this is why this concept of winning pins are so important, because when you look at all of the impressions, all of the clicks, all of the traffic, all of the value that's created organically on Pinterest, so much of it is going to flow to a very small percentage of the content. You want your content to be there, right? You want your content to be rising to that level. And so that's where we turned in the research to asking, well, what do winning pins look like, right? What are the characteristics of winning pins so that we can think about what to do and what not to do? And so with limited time here today, I couldn't go through everything. I think this part of the research, which was part 2, if you check it out on our site, I think it had 17 observations in that second part. I'm going to go through a few of the big ones here, but that's only due to time constraints. But we'll look at format of the pins, we'll look at design styles, we'll look at some information about color palettes, text fields, and then the impact of scheduling, which was always an interesting question for us. So first and foremost, when we look at just the format of the pins, again, idea pins, they were here, they were the dominant format for a long time. A lot of engagement, a lot of impressions were being pushed to them. Now they're gone. That's no longer the case. And so it's a valid question to ask, well, what types of pins are rising to the top today? And when we look at the top pins, in this case, looking at the top 0.1%, the vast majority of them are image pins, right? So those most viral pins are predominantly image pins. And when I say image pins, I'm talking, it's a single image, right? It's a single image as the media connected with the pin. And then there are other fields like title, description, and so forth. Video was the number 2 category. And generally, if we look at all of the pins here, there would be a relatively similar distribution, right? So this isn't necessarily to say Pinterest is favoring image pins. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure they're discounting video pins or any others. But naturally, the engagement with content is leading in this direction where users are engaging predominantly with image pins, and there are not yet other content types rising up to compete with that in terms of user engagement and attention. That said, for the videos, one thing that did jump out was looking at aspect ratio of the videos. You want them to be vertical, and this felt important enough to shout out because a lot of brands do have video content. And so, we looked at landscape videos, square, vertical that were a bit shorter, and then taller vertical ones. And in general, when we looked at video content, pretty much all of the activity in terms of saves, outbound clicks, impressions, was on vertical video pins. A little bit of a different dynamic with taller videos versus videos that were vertical, but somewhere between 2 to 3 in square in terms of ratio. And so interestingly, the taller ones did have higher levels of saves and clicks against them on average, but a few less impressions, a little bit less actual exposure. Not sure necessarily what might be driving that, but overall, I'd say it's safe to say keep it vertical. And if you're creating video with Pinterest in mind, make it vertical in the first place. On the image side, a big question is, do I just use my photography or do I actually design pins? And what was interesting here is we actually saw a pretty big disparity by category in terms of which pins were rising to the top. And after looking at this, it kind of makes sense to me, right? I don't know if I would have predicted it exactly in this way, but looking at the left-hand side, some of the categories that were more just, what we're calling raw images, it's just the photography itself, no design applied to it. That's obvious. Maybe there was some photo editing or filtering in some cases. But categories like decor, art, tattoos, photography, even a little bit less so fashion, beauty, these are categories that strike me as, okay, not only is it possible to have stunning photography in these categories and really high quality photography, but in a lot of ways, you can also tell the story in the photo, right? The photo doesn't often need context in those categories in order for someone who's quickly scrolling through a feed to understand what it is. In fashion, you can look at an outfit, understand what it is, determine whether or not you like it, and if you want to investigate further. That's not always the case in some other categories. And so on the right side, the categories that were heavier on designed images rising to the top, we have some of the bigger categories like food as one of them, health and fitness, kids and family. And so here you have a lot of content where sometimes you don't actually know what the thing is that you're looking at. It might still catch your attention and it might look cool or interesting in the photo, but for example, with a recipe, you may not know what the ingredients are in the finished product image that you're looking at from a recipe that was made. And that's why in these categories, it's logical that you would think, okay, images that were more designed, that might have text overlays explaining in a few words what this thing is that I'm looking at, would probably do better and would lead to more engagement. Also common with the design image categories is a lot of roundups. So, top 10 X, right? Top 25 X, whatever it might be. And some of these categories are particularly well suited to that type of roundup content. On the photography side of the equation, one thing that was really interesting, sometimes people get a lot of anxiety around what if I'm not the best photographer in the world? Can I still compete on these platforms, or do I need to become a professional photographer in order to compete? And so we actually did a manual analysis of the most viral pins, going pin by pin and categorizing the photography that was used in the pin, even if it was a designed image that had photos in it. And we categorized them as, broadly speaking, professional looking photography, semi-pro level photography, amateur level photography. And what was interesting that I didn't quite expect is even when it's a raw image pin, right, it's just the photography itself, you still have about half of the pins that are amateur or semi-professional style photography, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to be that world-class level of photography to still stand alone. If it's compelling, if it's expressing an interesting idea, if it's exposing something interesting to the viewer who then wants to engage with it. On the other hand, though, it makes sense that you would see a higher mix of more professional photography in that category. Whereas when you come over to the designed images side, it's a very different mix. It's a lot more amateur level photography, semi-pro level photography, not as much professional photography. And I think what this shows is even if your photography maybe isn't at that professional level, with good, clean designs for your pins, you can rise above it, right? And so you can actually elevate the overall performance of your content by placing design around it, and not just using the photography in those types of cases. And that, yeah, this seems to suggest that that's an effective strategy. Within the actual images, so color palette is something that comes up pretty often. Without even looking at the chart, which maybe I should have made it animated, I apologize. But one thing that was interesting is when you just look at the dominant color in the images, by far the top colors were whites, near whites, and grays, by far. And I think that's more indicative of how people stage photos, how they think about the blank space in designs, that it's okay to have white space, it's okay to have blank space, to use softer colors. And a lot of times you want to do that so that then the focus in your design or in your photo is going to pop more. But to put a number behind that that's not on the slide, actually 87 of 100 of the top hex codes here for colors were white, near white, or gray, right? So the very, very top, dominant by white space, near white, and gray within the image or within the design. But then filtering those out, an interesting question was, well, what comes next when you are looking at those focus colors, those accent colors? And we ended up grouping them into these two categories of, what we called Pinteresty soft and Pinteresty bold. But there was a mix here. There were bolder colors and there were softer colors. But interestingly, if you look at fundamentally which colors are succeeding, you are seeing a lot of neutrals in there. You're seeing a lot of things in the pink to purple ranges. You're seeing some blues and some golds, right? But there definitely was a trend that popped up here where there were certain colors that through various tones were emerging more frequently. When we go to the design pin side, this was one place where it frankly shocked me and challenged one of my beliefs, and one of the beliefs that we hear a lot, which is that you should use your brand colors in designing pins, and the data shows the opposite. So when we were looking at the designed pins that were more likely to go viral, interestingly, the number one color scheme for the design, and when we say design, we're talking about the backgrounds, the borders, the text overlays, the background of the text overlays, things like that. It was black and white. Black and white was actually the most common one. Simple, effective, easy to read, high contrast, right? That was number one. Number two, by a good bit, that was interesting, was matching the colors in the photo, which I'm actually kind of excited about that, because within our Tailwind Create tool, we actually have an option there to match the colors to the photo. So I'm glad that we have that. But jumping down a bit, we also have an option to match your brand colors and save your brand colors and use that in designing pins. And actually a very small percentage, less than 5% of the most viral pins were designed with the brand colors of the creator. That doesn't necessarily mean the other pins didn't have logos. It's just, they weren't the dominant colors that were being used. So you might still have some branding on the pin. But this was something that really made me take a step back and think about it. And I think where this is landing for me is a lot of times we get into a habit of thinking in our own frame of reference and our own frame of mind, instead of the frame of reference of the pinner who is viewing our content, right? For most of us, if we're not Coca-Cola or Apple or a brand like that, for most of us, that pinner doesn't know us. They don't know our brand. Our brand colors are not significant for them. They don't carry any special meaning into the content. And while over time we might want to create that association by growing our brand and by helping our brand become more prominent, the challenge is, what this data kind of shows, is if we lean into that too early, we potentially lose their attention in the first place, and we lose the opportunity to actually get them familiar with our brand and to build the brand association. And so specifically with the prominence of matching the colors in the photo, and then that being followed by the Pinteresty bold and Pinteresty soft categories that were generally more popular in photos, it suggests to me that we might be better off leaning into the type of color palettes that either just make sense for the content that we're creating, right? So if I have autumn or fall themed content, which doesn't quite match either of those sets of color palettes that I shared on the last slide, it might still be the right move to use autumn-y colors in the designs of the images that I'm ultimately going to post, because it will just make sense to users who are searching for things like fall nail colors or fall nail styles or fall recipes or Thanksgiving dinner recipes or things like that, right? So that's an interesting strategy there. And in cases where that doesn't make sense, then it seems like, black and white or leaning into colors that are succeeding more on Pinterest might be the better strategy to resonate more with the audience. And then once we've actually engaged them, once they've come across to our site and we have them in our environment, then we kind of win the opportunity to introduce them to our brand and build our brand. But if we try that too early, we might actually be turning them off. So that was a big one for me that really tested an existing belief. Another interesting one was we looked at the images and classified them by what type of design tool was most likely used in creating them. And we had 3 categories here, right? One which we called accessible design tools. These would be your tools like Canva, PicMonkey, Adobe Spark, those types of tools that are really geared towards design, but made to be relatively easy to learn, simple to adopt, inexpensive or free even. And the characteristics of pins that would fall in this bucket are usually that the designs are a little bit more complex than the next category. They have a bit more in terms of effects that are applied to them, or additional elements that have been added to them, or shadows and extra outlines, extra underlines, things like that, right? The largest category here was what we called the Tailwind Create category, and that's not necessarily to say these pins were made by Tailwind Create, but more in the style that we designed Create to make, which is ultimately simple, effective templates that don't necessarily have all the bells and whistles of more developed, more deep design tools, but it's really designed from a different philosophy, which is how do we make good pins quickly and efficiently from a value of our time perspective, as opposed to spending a lot more time to make incremental improvements on the design, right? And then there were a few that were non-design tools. What's interesting here is we had a 4th category that were professional tier design tools. So that would be like, you look at it and you say, there's no way they could do this without Photoshop, right? Like this design absolutely must have been using Photoshop. There weren't any pins in the most viral pins that actually landed in that category, not one. So the norm does seem to be sticking with simple design. Easy is good, easy is fine, easy is fast, and that ultimately gets to the level of quality that does resonate, level of quality and style of design that resonates with pinners. On the text side, there's more than just descriptions and text fields. So we did look at titles, we did look at alt text, and I'll share some of the brief notes here, even though I didn't create slides on it, again, just for time. But the description data in particular was interesting, right? Because a lot of times we think if Pinterest allows a certain length description, we better use every character, right? We better stuff as many keywords as possible. We want to put as much information as possible into it. And what we found here is that the most viral pins, while they still had, meaningful description length, 200, 225-ish average characters, they were actually shorter than the pins that did not perform as well. And I think what might be happening here is that the longer the description, the more risk of diluting the signal to Pinterest about what the pin is about. Maybe we add too many keywords. Maybe we add contradictory keywords. Maybe we add too much fluff that makes it harder to find the keywords. So when Pinterest is actually then categorizing the content, determining where to surface it, how to map it into the graph, they might not be quite as accurate. right? And that loss of accuracy means the pin gets shown to partially the wrong audience, which means there's going to be less engagement on it, which means it's going to lose the competition to become a winning pin that gets more engagement over time, right? So accuracy in pin descriptions, accuracy in pin titles, using the most relevant keywords or sets of keywords is where this data overall pointed me. On the pin title side, I think we saw it was 60% of the pins that used 25 or more characters in pin title. So again, like a multi-word phrase, a multi-word length title was the more popular style. It's not the type of platform where you want to add, vibe as the title and just post it, right? So you want to take the advantage of the pin title to send some additional signals to Pinterest. But that was interesting. And on the alt text side, we did see a pretty positive correlation between use of alt text and the alt text field, and then ultimately engagement and especially clicks on the pin. There were more than twice as many clicks on average on pins that had alt text than pins that did. So there could be a lot of reasons for that one in terms of how pins with alt text are ultimately processed, how they're shown, who they're shown to, or even just the fact that having alt text makes them more accessible and more useful, especially to vision impaired pinners. So in general, use of the text fields, a good thing. But it was interesting on the description side here to see that sometimes being more concise and more accurate might actually be better than trying to make it fill every character. And then, the other one I mentioned here, we had to ask the question, what does publishing through Tailwind do, right? It makes us nervous to even ask the question, but it's a valid question, and it's something we don't want to shy away from. What's interesting here is we did find that pins that were published through Tailwind were more likely to go viral, right? And so the green bars at the bottom, pins that had over 1,000 clicks in the period were 54% more likely to come from Tailwind. Pins that had 100 to 1,000 clicks, 33% more likely. At the other end of the spectrum, pins that had no clicks were less likely to come from Tailwind. To be clear, I am not suggesting and do not believe that this shows any bias by Pinterest towards pins just because they're published through Tailwind. I think what's more likely here is that our user base, our audience, are more likely to be using best practices when creating their content. And as a result of that, they create better content on average, which leads to better performance, right? But it's still nice to see, a general positive bias here. I certainly would have been nervous if it was a strong negative bias. With that said, I want to give you a quick sneak peek into what's coming up now. So we dug in this part of the research really deeply into what do winning pins look like. The next part that's coming up is all about fresh pins. So we have the winning pins, the pins that aged out, that won the competition for your attention, that ultimately will live on for a long time and drive a lot of value. The fresh pins are the early side of the life cycle, right? How do pins actually start? How do we know if a new pin is doing well or not doing well, given that we shouldn't be comparing it to a pin that's already fully aged out, that is now ranking for a search term and so forth, right? Like that's not a fair comparison if one pin has had 12 months worth of data behind it and the other one has had 12 hours, right? So that's what we're looking into. Some of the big things we found in this section, first is the concept of a fresh pin holding period, which there might be multiple things driving it, but something we hear often is, well, why are my brand new pins showing basically no stats, no engagement, no activity? There might actually be a very logical reason for why there's a delay there. A second big question was around relative decay of different strategies. And so one of the really interesting telling ones here is, okay, I have a URL on my site and maybe I only have so many pages on my site, right? So much content, so many products that I want to promote. What happens if I use new images when I pin and fresh images, or if I use the same image over and over again, pointing to that same URL? That's a really interesting chart, and I'm going to show you that one in a second just so you can get a sense of that data. What that and other data showed us is freshness is actually a spectrum, right? There's not a single definition where you say pin is fresh or not fresh. There's a spectrum here. There are more fresh pins, there are less fresh pins, and there are characteristics we can observe in the performance of the data to suggest how that spectrum plays out and what types of pins we would put at the top of the spectrum as being viewed as kind of most fresh and performing as most fresh versus least fresh and performing as least fresh. And then another interesting question was, what does a good start look like for a fresh pin, right? How do I actually benchmark my brand new pins in order to figure out if they're taking off well or not, given that they are so early in their life cycle and that they're just building momentum? So with that, I want to show this relative decay chart as something that we haven't published yet. So this is actually the first time we're showing it. But it's comparing what happens when I'm pinning pins that point to the same URL and I'm using fresh images over time, or I'm using repeated images, the same image over time. We have one after the next after the next. And what we see here is in both cases, there is a decay in performance, which makes sense, right? Like there is a limit to how much a specific page, a specific piece of content should be circulated. If I use the TV rerun example again, right? Pinterest doesn't want to get to a point where the whole platform feels like reruns, right? They want to have fresh content, completely fresh pages, completely fresh ideas, brand new products, get rid of the products that aren't in stock anymore, things like that, right? But the decay is drastically different when using the same image over and over again. And so the bar charts here are showing the very first time an image is pinned versus 2 to 5 times I've either pinned to the same URL with a fresh image or pinned to the same URL with the same image as the gray bar, then 6 to 10 times, 11 to 25 times. And you just see that dramatic fall off when I'm using the same image over and over again. And so, we're observing this in real data based on real accounts and what those accounts did over these million plus pins. And so we can just look at what actually happened here. But there really is a case for creating fresh images over time. If you want to maximize the value of the content you've worked so hard to create on your website, going a little bit further to make sure that you're pinning and using fresh images over time will then help you maximize your potential distribution of that content on Pinterest as well. Using the same image over and over, you might get some incremental distribution, you might get some incremental engagement, but it is going to decay a lot faster. So with that, that's what I've got prepared for today. I think we might do some Q&A or discussion, but if you want to dig in more here, we're tailwindapp.com. If you look for the Pinterest Best Practices Hub on our main nav menu, that's where this Pinterest research section comes in. And so you're welcome to go check it out and dig in more if you do want to see all the findings. And once part 3 is published, it'll be up there as well.
Oh my gosh. I even read this and I still didn't get everything. With you just explaining it, I was like a little shocked. If you have any questions, put them down below. I, of course, have a few because that's just how I am. I have a whole page, but I'm not going to do the whole page. These are some questions that my students have asked, that I have had asked in my Facebook groups, things like that. Do you have any plans to do like add LinkedIn or something like that? Or are you sticking with Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram at this point?
That's a good question. We're not actively working on that right now. So at the moment, what we have been working on, especially over the last 6 to 8 months at this point, is really refreshing the Pinterest functionality within the platform. And frankly, just multiple reasons for that. One is, our initial Pinterest functionality was built in like 2015 on old technology that is harder to update now. It's slower, it's less performant. People who use it and publish at high volumes run into issues with pages timing out and things like that. And we've just got to solve those issues and make it work smoothly. And in terms of being able to continue updating it, maintaining it, providing a quality product, getting it on modern technology is important. So we've done a lot of that work right now. And now what we're focused heads down on is the follow-up asks. As people are using the newer version, what ideas do they have for improvement? What are they missing that maybe we hadn't moved over yet? Where are there opportunities to further improve the user experience? But At the moment, that's where we're heads down, is specifically the Pinterest side, and really making sure we're refreshing it and making it as strong of a product as it can be and should be.
Yeah. And let me just tell you, because I'm in a Pinterest with a Pinterest like a mastermind with Simple Pin Media with Kate. And I love the new pin scheduler. So if you guys watching the video have used Tailwind in the past and maybe didn't like the newer version of it, they have the pin scheduler is like better than the old publisher. I am currently using it. I'm teaching it. It is amazing. So I appreciate you working on that because Pinterest is our bread and butter. So I appreciate that a ton.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I was really shocked that video is not the first. Because we, during the whole, what were they called again? The old pins, the idea pins, right? Video was like what we know. And if you look at any other platform, video is king. Like without video, your accounts don't typically grow on any other platform. So it was very rewarding to get this analytics and to be able to know that I think video does help you stand out on Pinterest. It will give you more impressions and more saves and things like that. But standard pins have always delivered the best outbound clicks, which as a business owner, not a consumer, that is what we're looking for. So that was shocking. Were you shocked?
I wasn't shocked from the perspective of I saw how my own feed changed after idea pins went away, and
Yes.
just realized that it was all idea pins. I was curious if that was a universal experience or if that was based on personalization that Pinterest has built into the feed now. That said, on the video side, well, a couple of observations. One is, and I don't know if I called this out clearly enough at the top, this research was 100% about organic pins, organic traffic, right? It wasn't about the ad side of the platform. And so I do see a lot of video on the ad side, and even on our own Tailwind account in leveraging Pinterest ads, we saw that video performed really strongly.
Yeah.
And maybe because the platform is more image driven, when ads or video, maybe they stand out a bit more. Within the viral pins, the viral organic pins, though, there were some examples of incredibly successful video pins. What I will say is they had very compelling content that was, it was an idea, a story, much better told through video than through an image. So one example I can think of is a company that I believe it's an interior design company that does, among other things, building kind of like custom in-home jungle gym play areas for kids.
Yeah.
And so they had videos of the kids playing and climbing on the bars and all of that. And then you zoom out or the camera turns around and you realize this is in someone's home. This is not, a party that they went to or something. For a product like that, I could see video being incredibly compelling because you're seeing the kids having fun, you're seeing the potential end product, and then it's also kind of shocking. There were others in the health and fitness and exercise space where they were showing workout routines and how to do specific exercises where it might be incredibly helpful for someone who is looking for additional exercises to do or where to get started, but they don't necessarily know what to do. So I still think video can be effective. It's just not as common on the platform today. And that might be something to watch over time. Does the mix of video change over time as people generally are more comfortable creating video, as people have more vertical video? I know from our support of Meta, this was also something they talked about for a while, was getting people to learn how to create vertical video because so many brands would publish landscape video and it just doesn't work in a mobile format, especially, right?
It doesn't work for the people who are looking at them, right?
Yeah,
Like the end user doesn't like those.
yeah. Think about when someone sends you a horizontal video on your phone and you're trying to watch it and you're squinting and you got to turn your phone sideways to actually view it. And when you're on these platforms, that isn't always a feature that's available. So, I think video can still be effective. It's definitely just not as prevalent.
Yeah, and I feel like everyone always, when they're doing video, they're always thinking of Instagram or TikTok as an
Hmm.
example. And those,
Yeah.
because I test a lot, those don't work. Those don't work. I did 5 videos a day for a month to test it, and
Yeah.
all my analytics just took a downturn. But the
Mm.
videos that work for me are the ones like if I'm doing like a wedding, right? I have video background, like video of what's going on, and then follow with the final images. I can't tell you how
Mhm.
many clients that I've booked from that simple video. So I think what you said is correct. You need a story or a reason,
Yep.
and sharing it in a way that creates curiosity, at least for them to click through to the content, to your website, to whatever they need to do. So yeah, the typical Instagram, TikTok type videos, 5 seconds, 7 seconds, they don't work. They just don't
Yeah.
work on Pinterest.
It's not what people are on the platform for, right? It's
Correct.
just a different use case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I was also shocked by the colors. So I have an opinion on why the results are like that. This is just my opinion of using Pinterest for since 2009. And I think that the the bold like black and white, whatever it is because it's standing out on the feed. So for instance, weddings, right? If you're looking for
Yeah.
wedding inspiration, you're going to see pastels everywhere. So I would create black pins. I would create like white pins with just the photo, but I still had some text on it to like get people to want more information. And those work great. And I'm happy to hear that you don't have to use those brand colors. Like I always educate, do 2 or 3 pins in your brand colors so your whole, Pinterest profile looks like your brand. But 9 times out of 10, the colors that you do to match the photo, which I know that that works, and now I see the data, but matching the photo or having something that stands out that's totally different in the feed is really, really helpful.
Yep.
So I was glad to see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Laura said, when I add pins to Pinterest directly, there is
Mhm.
no place to add alt text. Is that only through Tailwind Create?
Interesting. So
Are you
we
on
do
your
have
cell
the
phone or desktop? That's one question I
yeah.
have before.
Yeah, we do have the alt text field in Tailwind in the new pin scheduler. You actually have the option to toggle it on or off if you want to use it or don't want to use it.
Use it.
Uh, I personally, so I usually use Pinterest directly on my desktop, and I do have an alt text button. It's like a gray rounded button that's in the pin creation flow. I don't know on mobile if it's there.
I
That said, I will shout out Pinterest has been doing a lot of UI testing recently, and so it's also possible that sometimes people are in different test versions of
correct.
a given page, and so it's possible you don't have it and someone else does, but on desktop, I would look for like a gray button in the ping creation flow.
And if you're on your blog and you fill out the alt text as well as the description, all that thing, all that stuff on your pin, and someone pins it, alt text does transfer over to Pinterest. So if someone's on your website and they click to save it to their Pinterest, it will be there. I have never found, well, I rarely go on my phone to be pinning because I want to do a lot of pins. And so that I'm not going to do one by one on my cell phone. But I have looked for a student and I didn't see where you could do it. Like on your
Hmm.
cell phone, you can tag people and you can tag companies and you can tag products. But on desktop, it's touch and go if you have that ability. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. I think that usually means to me that they're working on something in the background. If it's sometimes yes and
Yeah.
sometimes no, it's a testing. It's they're always like wanting to do better. But Laura, if you she uses Pinterest for desktop. Yeah, so Tailwind does offer that.
Hmm.
You just
Yeah.
have to toggle it
In
on
the
in the new one. The
yeah
pin.
in the new pin scheduler.
Yeah.
But we really have seen a lot of testing from Pinterest recently. So our
Hunt.
CS team has gotten a lot of questions around like, why does my page look like this? Or sometimes someone has a new version of the page and now our browser extension doesn't work with it because it's a different page and we have to adapt and so forth. But we've seen a lot of testing in the last few months.
I'm a Pinterest pioneer, and they're starting to give us some stuff to like test, which I
Yeah.
cannot talk about, but it is a good sign when you see things that used to work and don't work now, or something that never worked and now it's working. That's typically because they're updating either your Pinterest account, right? Or Pinterest in general, because it can go both ways. Both of my Pinterest accounts, one I've had for years and years, and one I've only had for 6 years, and they look different even. So that is pretty typical. There is a global pin setting option in the pin scheduler to toggle on the alt text option. So yeah, just to let you know, Laura, you don't have to just go through Tailwind Create. In the pin schedule, you can toggle it on to use it.
Mhm.
For sure. And if you have a question, just click that little blue question mark in Tailwind. They're amazing at getting back to you, and they'll also send you an email when they do that, because typically I'm out of there by the time they're going to contact me back. So I love that function of sending an email too. This was amazing. I know how busy you are, so I'm going to go ahead and let you go. But I really, really appreciate you coming and talking about this. Everyone has opinions on Pinterest. And if Pinterest doesn't say something, then it is only an opinion. But when we're looking at like stats and research on a million pins, there's a good chance that like the stuff that you're sharing with us can really help a lot of pinners to try new things and potentially increase that traffic that they're getting from Pinterest, which is what business owners are there for, honestly. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day, and I'll get this video up in the Facebook group shortly.
All
Thanks.
right. Thank you, Jen.
Bye, guys.